another episode of Making a Difference in Mental Health. I'm your host, Danielle Young, with my co-host,
Wendy Grier. Nice to see everybody.
We're happy to be back again. And today's conversation is going to be a really interesting one. We're going to be talking about code switching. And Wendy, I know about code switching from my particular group of friends and probably within our particular demographic, but it's not really something that I really hear talked about in the work setting. And so we have our special guests here with us who are actually our colleagues as well, Mike and Matt, who are going to join in on the conversation.
Absolutely. Yes, code switching. We know about it in our community, but again, this is a topic that is not discussed a lot in the workforce. And so this is going to be a great conversation. We get to spotlight our colleagues and they get to share what they know about code switching. So welcome, Matt. Welcome, Mike, to the show.
Tell us about yourselves.
Well, thanks for having me. Of course, my name is Mike Harrison. I work in the finance department for ABH. I've been with ABH a little over a year and a half, almost 2 years. It's just been a great experience for me, myself, just learning a different demographic. I've always done corporate accounting, so now it's, doing a little bit of accounting outside the corporate world, but more into the medical side of things. Transitioning on, hearing different stories from the different colleagues about how you have to, handle different mental aspects of things.
I'm Matt Rosado. Hi, I'm Matt Rosado. Working in the finance department as well. I've been at ABH for about a year and a half. And I'm excited to be here, take part in the conversation.
All right. So again, thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Let's talk about code switching. So for me, when you think about code switching, if you want to be technical with it, code meaning some type of language, and then switching meaning toggling back and forth. And if you put that together when it comes to culture, when it comes to language, when it comes to environment, for myself and maybe even for Wendy in our particular group, our particular community, we understand it, especially in a professional atmosphere, to switch the way either maybe linguistically we talk, maybe even the way that we sound, to kind of survive in a particular environment, especially if the environment happens to be a predominantly white environment. And so I do also know that not only does the Black community do it, but also other communities of color. So for me, it's just switching to fit and to make it through, or to accommodate, or to assimilate to a certain environment through language, through interactions, mannerisms, yeah,
dress, also. So for me, it's how do I blend it? How do I not bring more attention to myself?
Yeah. What about you? Have you all heard of this term, and what are your thoughts about it? And even what kind of definition would you have for it?
For me, I define code switching as putting on a persona to fit your surroundings. What I mean by that is growing up for myself. I will give you a little background of myself. I grew up in a suburb area here in Frederick, Maryland. When I left Frederick and went to college, I went to a predominantly all white college, a private Catholic school out in the middle of nowhere. So you can only imagine how I had to adjust and, adapt to my different area. There was, of course, a lot of students, colleagues in that point who weren't around minorities at the time. So, us being a minority for one, and then being an athlete on top of that was just a different aspect for them to see. So as well as me having to adjust, other students had to adjust to me and my colleagues.
So for me, this is the first I'm really hearing of code switching. I've definitely experienced it in my life, more around the workplace, kind of, dressing different and talking a certain way. But in terms of outside of the workplace and like culture and stuff, yeah, this is a first for me.
Mm-hmm. And, oftentimes, even now, this is an example of making sure that we present a certain way for the podcast, the way that we speak, the way our body language, even the way that we present ourselves and are presenting this topic is even like a form of code switching. But what I do know is that after the cameras go off, I may get a little bit more relaxed, or even the way that I speak, some letters, or words may change or sound different just because of the comfort level that I would have, within a certain group or within my friends group, my family group. But it's also when we come back, it's putting it back on again. And Mike and I can only imagine. Actually, I can't imagine because my college experience was so diverse.
Right.
But just hearing you, I can try to imagine anyway the shifts and changes that you would have to go through at your university. And then how was that when you had to come back home,
Well, I would say it wasn't as much as a culture shock in the sense of coming back home. Like I said, growing up where I, in Frederick, like I did, it was very diverse. So my high school, I graduated with, 400 kids for all different backgrounds. And then you go from that to where the only minorities at my college are athletes. Now, outside of that, normally, if you are a minority there, it was always, are you sure you're not playing the sport? It was always questioned. Like more times out of less, they were going there not for academics, but more for athletic purposes that gave you the process of developing into the athletic world. But coming home, it wasn't that big of an adjustment because of the fact that I was still able to keep in touch with the group of friends that I had back home. So that aspect of it, because the whole purpose of code switching is you're one way here and another way there. Being an athlete, going to there, I was able to kind of still be myself around my peers, but outside of the peers, when you're meeting your professors, talking to your coach, you did have to act a different way to where you're not saying things that you normally would say around your friends, because it is being respectful and being proper. Was the upbringing of how you should, address and show yourself.
What about you, Matt? What are maybe some examples? Because you did say maybe even the way you dress or clothes or for a job interview or when you're speaking to a supervisor. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, mainly in those realms, or like speaking with grandparents is going to be different than at a hockey game with some friends.
I can imagine that.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But rather than drawing on my experience, I actually wanted to propose a question of I was curious if there was ever a time where you would normally code switch, like whether it be going back to school or maybe in a job interview, and you didn't code switch and it had like a negative outcome?
That's a great
That
question.
is a really good question.
I can't imagine a time where I didn't do that. I know that people may overhear me with a friend when I think we're in more of like a private setting and we're, talking like we would talk and not being in our like code switch mode. And a person asking, how come you guys are talking like that? And you don't do that when you're at work or with everybody else. It seems like it's so much fun and you're relaxed and all of that. So I've had that asked of me, but I've never had like just threw it to the wind and just said any old thing and then go south. So how about you? Yeah.
I really have to think. That is a good question because in certain communities, specifically Black communities, or at least from our experiences that we know about, there are certain things that you're trained or told or taught from the way that you dress, from the way that you lay your hair, if you're a woman, from the way that you greet someone. And most times it's coming from a space of you are a person of color. But when you greet a person who is not of color, when you greet a white person, you make sure that your tone, that your body language is comfortable enough and safe enough to be a receipt or for them to be receptive of what you say or what you do, or to be able to be accepted into, a space. And so I can't actually imagine 100% being myself if I'm in a space that is either predominantly white or where I am the minority. So that, Matt, was actually a really good question, because I've never thought of it
that
way, to just 100% be myself. And the only way that would happen, I believe, for me, is if I'm at the top or the peak of whatever that environment is. And I'm gonna give you an example. So our former president, Obama, constantly code switched, but it was very nuanced. So we know that he would give speeches on platforms, and I believe many other persons of high authority do the same thing. But I'm using Obama because there's a very funny and popular clip. Also, Key and Peele, the comedians, did this clip where they parodied Obama, that every time he greeted a CEO, and Mike is laughing, a CEO or someone who was a white older male, it was, hello, how you doing? They shake the hand. But when it was an athlete, when it was a grandmama, when it was a baby, come on, you're dapping them up, and it was the loosening up, because you identified. And then right from the switch, he switched back in the blink of an eye to, hello, how are you? Nice to meet you. And so that's a perfect example of even leadership switching and being able to do it so comfortably to be his 100% self, because he's at the highest office in the land. Right. You can do that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So if he dapped it up with everybody, and then there'd be scrutiny, there'd be criticism. He's not professional. He shouldn't have this office. He should, the list goes on and on and on. So that's another example.
Right. Even when he wore a tan suit,
that was the biggest thing ever. Oh my God, he wore a tan suit.
Mike is laughing. Mike, Mike, what are your thoughts? I gotta hear what you're thinking.
I would say that was an excellent question, because you never really sit there and think about, do you turn it on and off within a blink of an eye? Usually when you get in an environment, you kind of try to stay the course, in a sense of being on the path of, this is the way I'm going to be. Even though 1 minute you were just with your boys, and like you said, dapping them up. It's funny how, and I relate everything to sports, because I coach high school football, and I coach rec basketball, and I relate everything, because it just seems second nature. But when you're with your boys, I'm with the guys, I'm dapping them all up, getting them all pumped. But then when you see, because granted, we play a lot of white schools. So then when you go across and you see a coach, it's, oh, you got to, how you doing? Get that firm handshake, not come in and dap them and hug them up. But it's a great, but yeah, it's for me, it's, you try not to turn the switch on. If I did, I probably never even paid attention to it. It's once you're in that mode, you try to stay, like I said, stay the course.
I'm going to give another example. So the Obama example, I think we can all relate to. Matt, maybe, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I was reading about code switching just to prepare for the interview. Mm-hmm. And somebody made a comment that said, I knew when my mom was switching, because when her homegirls called, it was, hey girl. But when a bill collector called, it was, the comment was, she became a CNN correspondent in a snap. So like, hello, how are you? Oh, absolutely. Yes, sure. And so those are simple things that we might even be able to see in our home environment that we're conditioned. We don't even realize it. But Matt, that was an excellent question.
And maybe, the example of Obama in the tan suit is an example of your question of how he probably decided, I'm just going to be me and wear a tan suit, and how it went so far gone because people couldn't handle him as a president wearing a different color other than navy blue or black. It was like blasphemous almost that he put on a tan suit. And to this day, people still talk about it. Like we were like, yeah, he's, changing it up. Same thing with Michelle Obama's wardrobe. She showed her arms. She showed her arms. I thought people were going to faint about that. She brought her clothes from J. Crew, not a like bougie designer.
Mm-hmm.
And so they got flack on that because she was just being her authentic self. I like J. Crew. I like the style. I want to wear their clothes. But, and they stuck to it, even though they got a lot of unnecessary criticism.
On top of the fact that they were African American. So
yes.
I mean that's a whole nother
podcast.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. So we've been kind of talking about culture, and we've been kind of talking about from our perspective. Do you all have any? Well, Mike, you've already given personal stories about being a coach and also being an athlete, and just the different shifts and changes. And I kind of wanted to throw in another bit of information. How we end up switching is that in the first 8 seconds, we are able to assess in the first 8 words when we begin to hear people speak,
mm-hmm.
and then even seeing them within the first 8 feet. So it's the rule of 8. So 8 feet, 8 words, 8 seconds, we're able to assess, do we need to switch or are we safe? Is this environment comfortable enough for me to be my authentic self? And so whenever we're in certain environments, we assess which is the most appropriate me to show up. And for many of us, again, the way that we talk, the way that we speak, even for women, the straighter our hair is, sometimes it's more acceptable. And we've just learned to adapt.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially when we're trying to get something from someone else. You have to make that quick assessment to say, I'm going to be, Wendy with my homegirls, or am I going to be Wendy, corporate Wendy? And make sure that I dot my I's and cross my T's. And I come across as though I have some sense, I guess, or educated. So, yeah.
Matt, you were going to say something?
Yeah, to go off of that, is this something that your parents taught you when you were children to, make sure when you enter an environment to assess the situation? Or is this just something you just learned as you were growing?
For me, I come from parents who are educators. So one was an English teacher and one was a principal. So I didn't have a choice. I had to make sure that when I'm engaging outside of the home, that I speak properly, that I present properly, all of that. Yes, at home we could, loosen up and be, silly and, kind of code switch back to because it's comfortable in being around friends. And so also for me, I grew up mainly around a lot of white people. So I had to probably learn that code switching quick. And so I don't know if it was unconscious on my parents' part or I just watched them do it. I can't really say my mom because she's an English teacher, so you're never gonna like have her japping up anybody. But my dad, yes. And so I guess I had to like pretty much watch what they did and just always remember where I was until there was a time that I felt comfortable and I felt like people were seeing me for a friend and not seeing like what I looked like on my outside. So then I would relax and then, I could then dap up my white friends because we were cool and everything was okay. And so that was my experience growing up.
So I do believe that it stems and goes much further back. Wendy and I were talking about, again, this topic, and I brought up a movie. I don't know if you all have seen the movie The Help. Have you ever seen The Help with Viola Davis?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that when she makes the poop pie?
Yes, she made the poop pie.
Yes. Yes, that movie. But there's a quick scene that it's so, for me, it's so poignant because we're talking about the 1950s and 1960s, and code switching actually goes further back than this time period. We're talking about slavery. But there's a scene in the movie The Help where Octavia Spencer's character tells her daughter, who is now having to quit school and to help to become a maid. And what she says to her daughter is, no sass mouthing. And you can kind of figure out what that means. No talking back. She says, you know, you don't look at white people a certain way. When you respond to them, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, yes, sir, no, sir. This is the beginning of the conditioning of switching how you normally would be in your home, where you might be able to sass mouth or talk back to your sisters or your brothers, your parents, your siblings, your cousins, or just have fun. You know, you're just shooting the breeze, having fun, and you know, just cooling it or just chilling. But this is not what you do in a predominantly white space. And so we are conditioned, and I'm not just talking about myself at this particular age, but my parents as well as their parents were conditioned, and it is based on how you present yourself in predominantly white spaces, going all the way back even to slavery, even looking at someone in the eye, or even not dressing provocatively, or you know, there's so many things that we can go into that goes down that road to look at culture and to look at race, to understand how we get all the way in the 21st century to code switching. And when it comes to just my personal experience, both of my parents, in their own right, they're the eldest of their siblings, and they went to college, and my mom is in the pharmaceutical field. My dad is now retired, but my dad is also a speaker and a great orator. So, you know, for myself to even try to emulate and talk like him and talk like my mother, that was something that I found to be very prideful. But I also know that they grew up in the South, where when they go back home to the Carolinas, they're talking with that country twang, and you know, they're having a good time. But as soon as we get back to Maryland, and as soon as they get back on the job, it's back to that. Yeah, it's back to that professional space. Matt, you're asking good questions.
Yeah, you have great questions. Do you have any more? Because my biggest question is, or thought-provoking, is how do we think this affects mental health going forward? In our personal stories, do we see any negative effects of code switching, or is it just something that we just gonna have to keep doing? Or you know, do you know people that fight against it? I think the younger people do.
Yeah,
I think the younger people. I look at, let's just take sports, because Mike said sports is everything, and I'm with him. I love sports. You know, you and I always talk sports, and Matt too. So I noticed, you know, we talked last week when we were talking about social media and different generations, and I know my daughter is, Generation Z, and so this generation is a generation that prides itself on being authentic and not being fake, and being who they are, and kind of breaking traditions and things like that. And so I just see these young kids out here, you know, expressing themselves with their hair and their clothes, and you know, this is who I am, and kind of throw it in your face, and you got to accept it, because I'm not twerking and changing into something else just to fit in. This is who I am, but I'm also a great person. So I see that. I don't know if anybody else is seeing that kind of change in the generations, where this might have some different effect on code switching. You know, I'm a baby boomer too, so yes, Danielle and I live on the edge, and we of generations, and you know, we were modeled and shown and talked to about, you know, how you behave in certain situations versus, you know, with your friends. So I'm throwing all that out the kitchen sink just to hear what you all think about like this generation and where we go with the code switching and people's mental health and all of that good stuff.
Well, I think from an individual perspective, code switching can definitely benefit you in certain situations. However, I think from a societal perspective, it's not necessarily the greatest thing. I think as a society, we should strive towards accepting everyone. I think we are moving in that direction, but I don't think, for instance, all of you growing up had to imagine yourselves in order to fit into the situation. You had to change to be like everybody else, and that in itself, I don't think is a great way to live for society. I do think it's changing, but yeah, that's really how I feel about it.
Mhm. What about you, Mike?
It would be nice to say code switching is going to go away, but I don't think it would. I think it's here based on, how we're still raising our own kids. And think about, I said it earlier, in conversation is there's no true definition on how to raise your kids or how to raise a family. But the one thing that's constant that I instilled from my personal experiences, like you were saying earlier, Danielle, about your parents. What does your parents teach at a young age? Be respectful. Say, the key words that you're supposed to say around your peers and around others. And I think that part of the aspect is always going to be here because as parents, you want your kids to be respectful. And I get it. Like I tell my kids all the time, I get it. I'm your parent. I'm not your friend, which means is, you got to be able to talk to us like, have a civil conversation. You don't have to come in the house and be like, yo, what's up? None of that. All that stuff's out the window. It's more, growing up. And I always say when you walk in the house, it's good evening, good afternoon, those polite things that I'm instilling now to my kids and my generation that I would hope, 10 years when they have kids that they're doing the same thing. The key things for me, and I going talking about earlier with Matt's question about is it something that's taught at an early age? I would say in my household, it kind of was. Being the fact that when my mom got like elementary kids, my mom got phone calls. It's funny. We'll go to a parent teacher conference and then my mom will sit next to me and she'd be talking to the teacher and the teacher would be like, Mike's a great kid. He's well polite, well mannered. And my mom would look at me all side eye talking about Mike who? It's always, that's not the same Mike I get at home. But you're like, in a sense, at the time, you don't think about it, but you are adjusting to surroundings because this is growing up, it was a white teacher I had. So it's a white teacher. I can't come in and say things that I can normally say around my friends. You just had to change it up. And to me, with the mental health aspect of it, it's bad in a way that the social media has transformed everything. I think that's where the key is to where the code switch is because how else are, kids are expressing themselves. They're expressing themselves by always taking a picture of this is my outfit today. This is what I'm eating. This is what I'm eating. This is what I'm doing. And it's going out to millions of people to see across the land. For me, I would love for it to kind of adjust, but we see it. It's something that I think is going to be here for a while because it's just the way society is built. You have to be able to adapt. And we know being minorities, yes, we had an African-American president, but at the same time, we know that the next 4 years, it won't be the same, if that makes sense. We're not always going to have African-Americans on top. So in all in one bubble, we just have to be able to adjust to what we have.
Right.
Yeah. Mike, I really like the point that you bring up, even how social media impacts the way that we present ourselves. And Wendy's already brought up, her daughter was actually one of our guests, and she's representing the newer generation where it is, you're going to accept me for who I am. I'm going to say, talk, be, look, feel exactly how it is. I'm not going to cover up at all. And, I also feel like code switching is still here to stay. I think it will have several evolutions. So even the way that we are talking now might be like the King's Old English. I don't know, in maybe 50 years.
Right.
But I do think it's here to stay. I do think there's going to be an evolution of how we present ourselves. And in some spaces, some areas, some industries, it may fade out and you can just be who you want to be. But I still feel that if you are on top, there is more of an ability to switch in and out with a little more ease than it is coming up in whatever industry, whatever area you're in. And when it comes to mental health, I have had some clients and some students that I work with who are African American who have said, well, people make fun of the way I talk because I sound white. Or, and that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a whole nother podcast.
But this is what I mean. If then this particular student is taught at home not only to be respectful, but when you see certain people or when you're in certain areas, this is the way that you should talk. This is the way your tone should be. This is the way your volume should be. If Black women straightening, I've said something about hair a lot today, but straightening your hair or having it slicked down or not having it too big, because maybe too big equates to too loud or too boisterous. So I think that there are benefits because there is elevation in certain spaces, but to be authentically you, we have a long way to go. And I think it's here to stay. And I do think it'll go through a couple of elevations. And I think when it comes to the mental health, sometimes you do question. There's a couple of movies, as a matter of fact, out there. I can't think of the one right now. It has Lakeith, I can't remember his last name. He's in it, and Danny Glover, Switching Codes. And then there is another movie with Denzel Washington's son, Black Klansman. I think it was nominated for an Oscar about the same thing.
In the 60s. So that was really relevant because they were going after the Klan, and he was a new black detective. And somehow or another, he knows how to present, sounded white, and got sucked in the Klan and pretended to be somebody else so they could infiltrate the Klan and then take them down. And so that's a really good example of code switching and in the 60s, really.
And so imagine from the 60s to now, that would be about my parents' generation, and from their mental health when it comes to anxiety. Will I be, accepted, or do I sound good enough to be accepted, or do I look presentable enough to be accepted? I think, again, there are nuances to how it impacts mental health, but I still think there'll be some evolutions. And I'm just glad that we still have spaces and places where we can go to be our authentic selves. It just may take time for all of that to blend in.
Right. And I think it's important, again, to have these conversations, because if you don't have these conversations, then, we can't get to a point where maybe code switching does become obsolete and, it's not happening anymore. And I think I have a lot of faith in this new generation because, they're just looking at us like, really, you've created all these issues. We have to undo them all, and really pushing the whole thing of being your authentic self. Yeah. Where, people, just like Matt said, you accept people for who they are, and you don't worry about all these other things of race and so forth.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, would you have any thoughts, or, what is your takeaway from this? Mike and Matt, the floor is yours.
My takeaway is, this is always a great topic starter, because we don't never really sit there and think about it as much as, I haven't think about it as much as I did before having the opportunity to come on this podcast. I always joke because, once again, I go back into coaching. I'm the only African-American coach on my coaching staff. So I always joke and be like, I'm the token Black guy. Y'all don't have any more minorities, but y'all have me. So that kind of, makes you feel comfortable and adjust. But it's funny because I've been coaching with these guys for well over 10 years. So me talking to them becomes second nature in a sense. That if someone new comes into the equation, they're always on eggshells because they don't know how to approach me in a sense of, and I guess that's the flip side of the code switching, because where I've been the only minority with, my fellow white colleagues or my fellow white coaches, when we bring another coach in, it's usually another young white coach, and they come to address me as in they don't know how to work that bubble of what's the comfort zone, because they see everyone else coming, and of course, like we talked about, coming dapping me up and giving hugs. They come over and it's, hi. It's not what's up, it's hi. And then it's one of those, for me, going outside the level of saying, come here, give me a hug. Breaking him in the boat to let him be an adjust and make him feel warm and feel welcomed. But like I said, this is a great topic. I talk to my kids about a lot of different things. And then I was able to talk to them about, code switching and this. And then my daughter, she mentioned she's 18. And the first thing she came out of her mouth was, I don't think I code switch. She was like, I hang out with a bunch of minorities. I said, well, yeah, but you do understand just because you hang out with minorities don't mean that you're not actually flipping the script. And then she was like, well, I didn't think of that way. But in a sense, I got to break it down because she's mixed. So she has both, her mother's white and her father's black. So I try to make sure and understand that she is, sitting on both sides of the fence. But going back to having conversations with her, she always jokes and says, well, I identify as a minority. I said, but you do know you are both worlds. But, I hate to keep rambling. I apologize. But yeah, it's one of those. This is something I think it's like code switching. It's going to be here. Hopefully, like you said, Danielle, it can evolve and we get different forms, different fractions of it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about you, Matt?
So I wanted to thank you for having me on and giving me the opportunity to talk about this. This is very interesting and something I just wasn't aware of.
Well, thank you for joining us today on the show and asking such great questions. It sparked really good conversation, made us think, brought in, some different attitudes about things and code switching. So we appreciate you, Matt. Thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. We appreciate you, Matt. We appreciate you, Mike. Yep. And we appreciate the audience for always checking in with us and listening to our topics. And just know that code switching is actually everywhere. We've talked about different examples today, from the president to the office to the home
to sports.
The sports, right. And we could do a whole other podcast just on sports alone and the different things that happen within that particular arena. I might not lead that conversation. I'll leave that to Wendy. Right. But again, thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Danielle Young with my co-host
Wendy Grier.
And we are making a difference in mental health, always striving to make a difference in mental health. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.